At my daughter's birthday party, my mother-in-law handed her a tiny cupcake while the other kids got slices of the big cake. Some kids need to earn their treats, she said that, and my daughter looked at the floor. Then my husband's grandmother slowly stood up and said this. The entire room went silent. My mother-in-law humiliated my daughter in front of 20 people at her own birthday party. I wish I could say it surprised me, but it didn't. It was my daughter Emily's 8th birthday. The house was loud, kids running everywhere, wrapping paper already scattered across the living room. Emily had been counting down to this day for weeks. She talked about the cake every morning before school. 3 layers, pink frosting, strawberries on top, her name written across the middle. I carried it to the dining table while everyone gathered around. Phones came out. Kids started shouting for Emily to blow out the candles. She closed her eyes, made a wish, and blew them out in one breath. Everyone clapped and the room filled with that happy chaos birthday parties always have. I started cutting the cake and passing slices to the kids. Then my mother-in-law Karen walked over and took the knife out of my hand. He said she would help. I stepped aside because the table was crowded and I figured it would make things easier. Emily stood near the end of the table waiting for her piece. She still had a paper crown on her head from one of her friends. Karen handed out the next few slices. Big pieces, thick frosting. The kids grabbed their plates and ran off laughing. Then she reached Emily. Instead of cutting a slice, Karen opened a small bakery box she had brought earlier and pulled out a tiny cupcake. Plain, no decoration, no frosting swirls, just a small cupcake sitting in a paper wrapper. She placed it in front of Emily. Every other kid in the room had a slice of the big birthday cake. My daughter had a cupcake. Emily stared at it. Then Karen said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Some kids need to earn their treats. Emily didn't say anything. She just looked down at the table. And the worst part was this wasn't new. Karen adored Ethan's sister's kids. They could do no wrong. She bought them expensive gifts, praised everything they did, and told everyone how talented they were. With Emily it was always different. Karen always had something to criticize. Her clothes, her grades, the way she talked. At first I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But children notice things adults pretend not to see. Emily noticed. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could speak, a chair scraped slowly across the floor behind us. Everyone turned. Ethan's grandmother Margaret was standing up. She was 92 and usually quiet during family gatherings. Most of the time she just watched everyone from the corner of the room. But this time she walked toward the table. Slowly. She stopped beside Emily and looked at the cupcake. Then she looked straight at Karen. And what she said next made the entire room go completely silent. Margaret looked at Karen for a long moment. Then she said, "Put the knife down." The room got quiet immediately. Karen frowned like she didn't understand why she was being corrected. She still held the knife in one hand and the cake server in the other. "No," Karen said. "I'm finishing the cake." Margaret did not move. "Put the knife down." Karen slowly placed the knife on the table. Kids stopped talking. Even the parents who had been chatting near the couch turned their heads toward us. Margaret looked at the cupcake in front of Emily. Then she picked it up and held it in her hand for a moment. "Who brought this?" she asked. Karen crossed her arms. "I did." Margaret nodded once. Then she placed the cupcake back down and took a clean plate from the stack. She picked up the knife herself and cut the largest slice from the cake. A thick piece with strawberries and frosting across the top. She placed it in front of Emily. "Birthday girls get the first real slice." Emily looked at the plate, then at Margaret. Karen spoke immediately. "Mom, that's not the point." Margaret looked at her. "What point?" Karen gestured toward Emily. "She needs to learn that behavior has consequences. She was rude last week when we visited." Emily froze. I knew exactly what Karen was talking about. Last weekend Karen had brought gifts for Ethan's sister's kids. She handed them out right in front of Emily. When Emily asked if there was something for her, Karen said no. Emily had walked away quietly. Apparently that counted as being rude. Before I could respond, Margaret spoke again. "She is 8. Karen shrugged. "That's old enough to understand respect." Margaret turned to Emily. Eat your cake. Emily nodded and slowly picked up her fork. Karen looked irritated now. She glanced around the room, probably realizing everyone was watching. This is exactly the problem, she said. You always defend her. Margaret looked at Karen again. No, she said. I defend children. The room stayed quiet. Karen gave a short laugh. Well, maybe you spoil her too much. Margaret did not answer right away. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat down next to Emily while the girl took a small bite of cake. Then Margaret said something that no one in the room expected. Good. I'm glad you mentioned that. Because I was planning to talk about something today. Karen frowned. What are you talking about? Margaret looked around the room at the whole family. Then she said calmly, I finished my will last week. The second Margaret said that, the room shifted. Everyone in Ethan's family knew Margaret was wealthy. Not flashy wealthy, but the kind that quietly builds over decades. She owned several rental buildings in town and a large piece of land that had become very valuable over the years. Whenever people joked about it, Margaret just smiled and changed the subject. So when she said she had finished her will, nobody spoke. Karen gave a small laugh. Mom, this is not the time to talk about that. Margaret ignored her. She looked at the table where Emily was quietly eating her cake. Then she looked around the room at the rest of the family. I made my decision. Ethan's sister Laura straightened in her chair immediately. Her two kids were sitting beside her with cake smeared across their faces. Karen folded her arms. What decision? Margaret answered simply. When I pass away, everything I own will go to Emily. For a moment I thought I heard it wrong. The entire room went silent in a way that felt heavy. Laura blinked first. Wait, she said. What? Karen's face changed completely. You're joking. Margaret shook her head. No. Laura laughed like this was some strange misunderstanding. Mom, you have 4 grandchildren. Margaret nodded. I know. Karen leaned forward. This doesn't make any sense. Margaret looked directly at her. It makes perfect sense. Laura looked at Ethan. You knew about this? Ethan shook his head slowly. No. Now the room was tense in a different way. Parents started quietly pulling their kids away from the table, sensing something was happening. Karen looked angry now. You're saying you're giving the house, the land, the buildings, all of it to one child? Yes. Laura scoffed. That's ridiculous. Margaret stayed calm. I made the decision carefully. Karen pointed toward Emily. She's just a child. Margaret nodded again. Yes. Laura leaned forward across the table. So what about my kids? Margaret looked at them briefly. Then she answered. They have parents who love them and support them. Karen's voice got sharper. And Emily doesn't. Margaret looked directly at her. She has Luna. My name hung in the room for a moment. Then Margaret added something that made Karen's face turn red. And someone needs to make sure this child grows up knowing she is valued. Karen pushed her chair back loudly. This is unbelievable. Laura stood up, too. You're dividing the family over a child who isn't even your favorite grandchild. Margaret looked confused for a moment. Then she said something quietly. She is. That was when the real argument started. The room exploded. Karen started talking first, then Laura talked over her, and within seconds everyone was arguing at the same time. This is insane. You can't just pick one child. What about fairness? I stood there next to Emily while the adults argued like they had forgotten there were kids in the room. Emily had stopped eating. She looked confused and kept glancing at me. Ethan stepped between his mother and grandmother. Everyone calmed down. Karen pointed at Margaret. You've lost your mind if you think this is acceptable. Margaret sat calmly at the table like none of the shouting bothered her. I made my decision months ago. Laura shook her head. You're destroying this family. Margaret finally looked directly at her. No. I'm exposing it. That made Laura even angrier. You think you're proving some point? Margaret answered simply. Yes. Karen turned toward me suddenly. This is your doing. The entire room looked at me. I blinked. What? Karen laughed. You've been filling her head with stories about how badly Emily is treated. I haven't said anything. Karen scoffed. You didn't have to. Margaret interrupted. Leave Luna out of this. Karen ignored her. You think we don't see what's happening? You're turning Mom against her own family. Ethan stepped forward again. Stop. Karen shook her head. No. Someone needs to say it. She pointed toward Emily. That child is spoiled. Emily immediately looked down again. That was the moment something changed in Ethan's face. I had seen him annoyed before. I had seen him frustrated, but this was different. Enough, he said. Karen looked surprised. You're taking their side. They're not sides. Karen folded her arms. So, you're fine with your daughter taking everything from the rest of this family? Ethan looked at Margaret. Did you really finalize the will? Margaret nodded. Last Tuesday. Karen laughed again, but there was no humor in it. Well, don't worry, she said. This won't stand. Margaret tilted her head slightly. It already does. Karen looked confused. What does that mean? Margaret reached into her purse slowly and pulled out a folded envelope. She placed it on the table. Because it's not just a will. Everyone stared at the envelope. Karen narrowed her eyes. What is it? Margaret looked around the room one more time before answering. It's the letter explaining exactly why none of you are getting anything. No one moved for a moment. The envelope sat in the middle of the table like something dangerous. Karen finally reached for it, but Margaret placed her hand over it first. No. Karen looked annoyed. Then why bring it? Because I want you to hear it. Laura crossed her arms. This should be good. Margaret unfolded the paper slowly. The room stayed quiet now. Even the kids in the living room had gotten quieter, like they could sense the tension. Margaret adjusted the paper and began reading. For years I watched how this family treats its children. Not equally, not kindly. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. Karen rolled her eyes. Margaret continued. I watched gifts being handed to some grandchildren while others stood nearby pretending it didn't hurt. Karen muttered something under her breath. I watched adults correct a child more often than they praised her. Emily was sitting very still beside me. Margaret kept reading. And today I watched a grandmother give a birthday cupcake to a child while every other guest received her cake. Karen snapped. Oh, please. Margaret lowered the paper and looked at her. You thought no one noticed. Karen laughed nervously. You're exaggerating. Margaret shook her head slowly. No. I'm finally saying it out loud. Laura leaned on the table. So, your solution is to reward one kid and punish everyone else. Margaret looked at Emily again. This child has been the quietest one in this family. The one who apologizes when she hasn't done anything wrong. Nobody spoke. Margaret folded the letter again. I am leaving everything to Emily because she is the only one in this family who has never expected anything from me. Karen stared at her like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. That's absurd. Margaret shrugged. Maybe. Karen's voice hardened. Well, I hope you realize something. Margaret waited. Karen said, if you go through with this, you will never see your grandchildren again. Laura nodded immediately. None of you will come around anymore. The threat hung in the room. Margaret didn't react the way they expected. Instead, she looked at Emily, who was quietly finishing her cake. Then she said something that made Karen's face change completely. That won't be a problem. Karen frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Margaret looked directly at me. Because Luna already promised me something earlier today. Karen turned toward me slowly. What promise? I took a breath. And then I said the thing that made the entire situation even worse. Everyone was staring at me. Karen's face had that tight look she always got when she expected to win an argument. What promise? She repeated. I didn't raise my voice. I promised Margaret she would always be welcome in our home. The room went quiet again. Karen blinked. What? I kept my eyes on her. She asked me earlier today if she could still see Emily if things got tense in the family. I told her she could see her whenever she wanted. Karen let out a short laugh. Oh, that's rich. Laura shook her head. So, you've been planning this together? Margaret spoke calmly. No. I asked Luna a simple question. She gave me an honest answer. Karen pointed toward Emily. You really think this child is more important than the rest of your family? Margaret answered without hesitation. No. Karen waited. Margaret continued. I think kindness is more important. Karen scoffed. This is unbelievable. Ethan finally spoke again. Mom, look at what just happened today. Karen turned toward him. Oh, don't start. You embarrassed my daughter at her own birthday party. Karen waved her hand. It was a cupcake. Ethan shook his head. No, it wasn't. Laura stepped in again. You're really choosing them over your own family? Ethan looked at her. They are my family. That ended the conversation. Karen grabbed her purse. Fine. She turned toward the door and Laura followed her. This will not last, Karen said before leaving. You'll regret this. Within minutes they were gone. The house slowly settled again. Parents took their kids home, the decorations started coming down, and the party ended in a strange quiet. Emily hugged Margaret before she left that night. Thank you for the cake, she said. Margaret smiled. You're welcome. Over the next few weeks things got worse. Karen and Laura began calling Ethan constantly. Angry messages, accusations, complaints about the will. They told relatives we had manipulated Margaret. They tried to turn other family members against us. And the strange part was that the will hadn't even taken effect. Margaret was still alive and perfectly healthy. But the resentment kept growing. The way they spoke about Emily started bothering me more and more. One evening after another angry phone call from Karen, I made a decision. I looked at Ethan and said it plainly. I don't want them around Emily anymore. He didn't argue. And that was the moment I officially told Karen and Laura something they didn't expect. They were no longer allowed to have any contact with my daughter. Not now. Not later. Not ever again. Not ever again. Not ever.